بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما علمتنا وزدنا علما. Last week we spoke about the passing away of Adil al-Ayyubi rahimahullah. Adil was the brother of Salahuddin al-Ayyubi, and he passed away, Adil passed away in the year 615 of the Hijrah, which corresponds to the year 1219 of the Gregorian calendar. So after Adil passed away, the Ayyubid kingdom was divided amongst the sons of Adil. Adil, he had three sons that he divided his kingdom amongst. They were Al-Kamil ibn Adil, who was made in charge of Egypt, Al-Mu'azzam Isa ibn Adil, who was made in charge of Damascus and Jerusalem, and Al-Ashraf ibn Adil, who was made in charge of Hawran. So these three sons of Adil took over the Ayyubid kingdom after Adil passed away. All right, after this, the Christians attempted to start a new crusade. They attempted to start a new crusade, and their plan in this crusade was to first take over Egypt. And then after taking Egypt, they wanted to go to Palestine and take over Jerusalem. And this crusade was made under the order of Pope Innocent III. He's the one who announced this crusade. And John de Brienne, who was known to the Christians as the King of Jerusalem, he was the one who was the main commander of this crusade. Now, John de Brienne, he was known as the King of Jerusalem, even though the Christians did not have control of Jerusalem at that time. The Christians did not have control of Jerusalem at that time, but they still kept the name of their kingdom as the Kingdom of Jerusalem. So this man, John de Brienne, he was known as the King of Jerusalem, even though Jerusalem was not under his control. So he was the main commander of this crusade. Now, as we spoke about last week, this plan of the Christians failed, this crusade failed, and the Christians were not able to conquer Egypt. They were able to conquer the city of Dimyat, but they were not able to continue and conquer Cairo. And when they realized that they were not going to be able to conquer Cairo, they retreated back to Dimyat, and then they were forced to leave Dimyat as well. So they left Egypt without fulfilling their objective. They left Egypt without fulfilling their objective, and this crusade turned out to be a failure on the Christians' end. So they ended up leaving Egypt and they went back to Akka, which is on the Palestinian coast. All right, now as for the three sons of Adil who collectively ruled the Ayyubid lands, Al-Kamil was in charge of Egypt, Al-Mu'azzam was in charge of Damascus and Jerusalem, and Al-Ashraf was in charge of Hawran. In the beginning, these three tried to work together. They ruled their separate lands, but they tried to keep a sense of unity with each other. But this unity didn't last long, and eventually they started fighting with each other. Right? Eventually the infighting began. So Al-Mu'azzam, the son of Adil, who was in charge of Damascus and Jerusalem, he sought the help of Jalaluddin al-Khawarizmi, who was the head of the Khawarizmi state. And the Khawarizmi state, they had control of northern Persia. So Al-Mu'azzam, who was the Ayyubid ruler in charge of Damascus and Jerusalem, he asked for help from the Khawarizmis to send support to him to fight against his brothers. He wanted to fight against Al-Kamil and Al-Ashraf. Now in response to this, Al-Kamil, he sought help from the outside as well. He saw his brother is seeking help from the outside, seeking help from the Khawarizmis. Al-Kamil, to defend himself, he thought that he should seek help from the outside as well. So who did he seek help from? He sought help from Frederick II. Frederick II was the Emperor of Germany. Right? So he sought help from the Christians, actually, from the Emperor of Germany, to support him against his brother Al-Mu'azzam. But do you think Frederick is going to help Al-Kamil just for no reason, or he would want something in return? Of course he would want something in return. So what did Al-Kamil promise Frederick? Al-Kamil, the son of Adil al-Ayyubi, the nephew of Salahuddin al-Ayyubi, who was in charge of Egypt, he promised Frederick II, the Emperor of Germany, that if he helps him against his brother, that he will give him Jerusalem. He said, I will give you Jerusalem if you help me against my brothers. Look at this betrayal. You can see that the next generation of Ayyubids after Salahuddin and Al-Adil were not like the first generation. They were not like Salahuddin or Adil. Right? The sons of Salahuddin and the sons of Adil were not like Salahuddin and Adil. So Al-Kamil, he offered Frederick Jerusalem in return for his support against his brother. Now Frederick II, the Emperor of Germany, this guy was a very interesting figure. Right? He was known as Qaridul Kanisa. He was known as the outcast of the church. And why was he known as the outcast of the church? Because the Pope had excommunicated him. So the Catholics, they have this concept called excommunication. Basically, they falsely believe that the Pope, the Catholic Pope, has Jannah and Jahannam in his hand. Right? They believe that the Pope can say that, okay, you are doomed to hell. And they also believe that the Pope can say, okay, you are guaranteed heaven. Right? They give this power to the Pope. Right? Wal-'iyadhu billah. Of course, this is a belief of shirk. Right? But the Catholics, they believe this, that the Pope has the power to excommunicate people to hell or to grant people Jannah. Right? So this man, Frederick II, the Emperor of Germany, he was excommunicated by the Catholic Pope because of some disagreement that he had with the Pope. So he was known as the outcast of the church, the one who has been excommunicated by the Pope. All right, but now he's in these negotiations with Al-Kamil, right? And Al-Kamil is offering him Jerusalem. So Frederick II, he came to Palestine with just 500 soldiers. He came with a small army of 500 soldiers, and he was ready to support Al-Kamil in exchange for Al-Kamil giving Jerusalem to him. Now by this time, John de Brienne, who was known as the King of Jerusalem, he had died by this time. And he had a daughter named Isabella. So she inherited his title. She inherited the title of her father. So he was known as the King of Jerusalem. When he died, Isabella became known as the Queen of Jerusalem. She became known as the Queen of Jerusalem. So Frederick, he saw this young girl, she's single, and she has a great title, Queen of Jerusalem. And he himself is the Emperor of Germany. So he thought, he should marry her. He thought that he should marry her, and this would actually add to his prestige and to his power. So he proposed to her. Frederick proposed to Isabella, the daughter of John de Brienne, and Isabella was very happy at this proposal. This is the Emperor of Germany. He's a powerful man. So she happily accepted that proposal. So when Frederick married her, in addition to being the Emperor of Germany, he also became known as the new King of Jerusalem, because he's married to the woman who's known as the Queen of Jerusalem, right? So he became known as the King of Jerusalem, the Emperor of Germany and the King of Jerusalem. All right, now around this period, Al-Mu'azzam, the son of Adil, who ruled Damascus and Jerusalem, he died in the year 624 of the Hijrah, which corresponds to the year 1227 of the Gregorian calendar. Al-Mu'azzam died. So when Al-Mu'azzam died, his lands were divided between the two remaining brothers, Al-Kamil and Al-Ashraf. So Al-Kamil took Jerusalem and Al-Ashraf took Damascus. Right? Initially, Damascus and Jerusalem were the lands of Al-Mu'azzam. But now that Al-Mu'azzam died, Al-Ashraf took Damascus and Al-Kamil, he took Jerusalem. So now Frederick, he wants to collect. What did Al-Kamil promise to Frederick? He promised him that he would give him Jerusalem. Now Frederick is here to collect. And Al-Kamil now has Jerusalem under his control. It's not under Al-Mu'azzam's control anymore. Now it's under Al-Kamil's control because Mu'azzam has died and Jerusalem has come under Al-Kamil's control. So now Frederick says, look, you promised me Jerusalem. Now Jerusalem is also under your control. So you need to give me what you promised me. So what did Al-Kamil do? He agreed. He agreed. And he signed a treaty with Frederick in the year 627 of the Hijrah, which corresponds to the year 1229 of the Gregorian calendar. He signed an agreement with Frederick that Frederick would not attack Egypt or any of the lands that are under Al-Kamil, that those lands are safe from Frederick and the Christians. They would not try to take over or touch those lands. And in return, Al-Kamil would turn over Jerusalem, Al-Nasirah, Bethlehem, Lud, and Sayda to Frederick. Frederick would take these cities. And as for the rest of Al-Kamil's lands, including Egypt and the other lands that he had, the Christians would not touch those lands. This was the agreement that Al-Kamil made with Frederick, and he literally surrendered Jerusalem to the Christians. He gave Frederick II Jerusalem on a silver platter. So this was a great betrayal to the ummah that was done by Al-Kamil. And Al-Kamil, can you believe this person is the nephew of Salahuddin Ayyubi, the conqueror of Jerusalem? Right? But he gave Jerusalem to Frederick II on a silver platter, without a fight, right? Just to preserve his own power and to preserve his own throne. So Frederick II, he considered this a huge win for himself and for the Christians, right? He basically got Jerusalem for free. He got Jerusalem for free, without a struggle, without a fight. He came into Jerusalem personally. He made pilgrimage to the church in Jerusalem. And when he came into Jerusalem, remember Frederick, he was known as the outcast of the church. The Pope had excommunicated him, right? So actually when he entered Jerusalem, when Frederick II entered Jerusalem after Al-Kamil had given it to him, he enters Jerusalem, and the Christian priests in Jerusalem, they're throwing trash at him, because this person is the one who was excommunicated by the Pope. So the people are throwing trash at him, and he's coming into Jerusalem, after being given Jerusalem by Al-Kamil. And he told the Christians, Frederick II, he told the Christians in Jerusalem that you should thank God that he gave you back Jerusalem without war, without fighting, without any bravery. You didn't have to show any bravery or any courage, and you got Jerusalem back. And this is nothing less than a miracle from God. This is what Frederick II is telling the Christians of Jerusalem. So Frederick, he was able to accomplish with only 500 soldiers what Richard the Lionheart couldn't accomplish with 500,000 soldiers that he brought from Europe. And remember, we spoke about Richard the Lionheart and his battles with Salahuddin, right? And in the end, Richard the Lionheart was not able to conquer Jerusalem. And he had 500,000 soldiers with him, Richard the Lionheart, the King of England. With 500,000 soldiers, he could not conquer Jerusalem from Salahuddin. But now Frederick II, he takes Jerusalem from Al-Kamil with only 500 soldiers. And those 500 soldiers didn't even need to fight. Right? Frederick was handed Jerusalem on a silver platter by Al-Kamil. So look at the difference between a strong, brave ruler like Salahuddin and a weak, cowardly ruler like his nephew Al-Kamil. Look at the difference. A strong king like Richard the Lionheart with 500,000 European soldiers behind him could not take Jerusalem from Salahuddin. But Frederick II easily takes Jerusalem from Al-Kamil. Rather, Al-Kamil hands Jerusalem over to Frederick II. Wal-iyadhu billah. Right? That's the difference between a strong ruler and a weak, cowardly ruler. So of course the Muslims were so angry. They lost Jerusalem again. After Salahuddin had put in so much effort, years of jihad, and before Salahuddin, Nuruddin Zinki, years of jihad with the goal of retaking Jerusalem, and finally they were able to achieve it. Now, Al-Kamil, he just gives it away like it was nothing. Right? So the Muslims were rightfully angry at this. How could Jerusalem be given up? The people started insulting Al-Kamil. Everyone around the Muslim world, when they would hear the name Al-Kamil, they would curse him and they would insult him whenever his name was mentioned. This is the person who gave up Jerusalem. Right? Now, in the year 1230, the Pope lifted the excommunication that he had placed on Frederick. Right? He lifted it. He said, okay, you're not excommunicated anymore. You're not in hell anymore. Now I give you Jannah. Right? The Pope, he said this to Frederick II due to his bringing Jerusalem back into Christian hands. So this is how, after all of Salahuddin's efforts and the efforts of Nuruddin Zinki before him, after all of that hard work, after all of those years of struggle and jihad, after Salahuddin successfully took Jerusalem back from the Christians and brought it back into the hands of the Muslims, 42 years after Salahuddin took Jerusalem back, 42 years later, his nephew Al-Kamil literally just handed it back to the Christians. So Salahuddin took Jerusalem. He conquered Jerusalem in the year 1187. And now in the year 1229, this is when Al-Kamil, he gives Jerusalem to Frederick II. So 42 years after Salahuddin conquered Jerusalem, it was given back to the Christians. And the agreement that Al-Kamil made with Frederick II was an agreement for a period of 10 years. It was an agreement that was made for a period of 10 years that Jerusalem would remain with Frederick II for the period of this agreement. So Jerusalem did remain under the rule of Christians for the next 10 years after that. And the Christians, they kept soldiers in Jerusalem, but their main capital remained Akka, which was on the coast, on the Mediterranean coast. And they hoped that more soldiers now would come in from Europe. Now that they have Jerusalem again, they thought more soldiers would be sent from Europe, to strengthen their grip in the land and to possibly expand into more cities of Palestine. But that didn't work out for them. Right? They were thinking more Christian soldiers would come in from Europe, but that didn't work out. Why? Because between the year 1230 and 1239, during that decade, a lot of internal problems started within Europe. The kings of Europe started fighting each other, right? So they became busy with their own internal issues, the Europeans, right? So that prevented them from sending support to the Christians in Palestine. And Frederick II himself, after taking Jerusalem, after being handed Jerusalem, he eventually had to return to Germany. He couldn't stay in Jerusalem, even though now he's considered the king of Jerusalem and he actually literally now has Jerusalem under his control. He couldn't stay there because he's the king of Germany, so he had to go back to Germany, but he still ruled Jerusalem remotely, right? Jerusalem was still under his rule. Now, around the same time period, the Ayyubids entered into an alliance with the Seljuks. The Ayyubids entered into an alliance with the Seljuk dynasty against the Khawarizmiya. Because these Khawarizmiya, the Khawarizmis, who were in control of the northern part of Persia, they had begun to threaten the Abbasid Khalifa. Right? So the Abbasids at this time, they were facing two threats. They were facing the threat of the Mongols from the east, and they were facing the threat of the Khawarizmis from the north. Right? So the Ayyubids were afraid. The Ayyubids were afraid that if the Khawarizmis toppled the Abbasid dynasty, then they would come after the Ayyubids next. If they're able to conquer the Abbasid dynasty, then they would come for the Ayyubids next. So the Ayyubids decided to ally themselves with the Seljuks to have more strength against the Khawarizmis. So you can see, the political situation here is very delicate. So the Ayyubids during this time, they're busy trying to protect themselves from the Khawarizmis, and this distracted them from trying to fight against the Christians. right? They were too worried about the threat from the Khawarizmis to focus on the Christians. As for the Mongols, they eventually reached the Khawarizmi state. The Mongols were very barbaric people, right? They had no mercy. They would come into lands, they would come into cities, they would slaughter everyone. They would kill men, women, children, combatants, non-combatants, they didn't care, right? They would literally take people, execute them, skin them alive, eat them, take their skulls, drink wine from the skulls of people. This is how the Mongols were, right? They were very, very barbaric people, and they were very large in number as well. They were huge in numbers as well, right? So eventually these Mongols, they reached the Khawarizmi state, and a great battle ensued between the Mongols and the Khawarizmis. And the Mongols defeated the Khawarizmis. And the king of the Khawarizmis was defeated as well, and most of his army was defeated as well by the Mongols. And with this, then the Mongols were able to surround Iraq after they defeated the Khawarizmis. Now the survivors of the Khawarizmi army, they fled to Sham, right? The army was pretty much obliterated, but there were a number of survivors, right? So those who survived, they fled to Sham, and they were still not able to re-establish their state in Sham. They were not able to re-establish the Khawarizmi state in Sham, but they were able to form some groups. They were able to form some groups, and they still had some amount of power and influence, right? They didn't have a full state anymore, but they did still have some power and some influence. Now remember, what is the reason why the Ayyubids and the Seljuks allied? They allied because of the threat of the Khawarizmis. They were afraid that the Khawarizmis would take over the Abbasids and then they would come for the Ayyubids. So that is why the Ayyubids allied themselves with the Seljuks, because they thought that this would make them stronger against the threat of the Khawarizmis. But now the Khawarizmis, they're pretty much obliterated. They don't have a state anymore. They don't have an army anymore. So that was the whole reason for the alliance between the Ayyubids and the Seljuks. Now that the Khawarizmis are gone, the Ayyubids and the Seljuks started fighting with each other. They had allied with each other because of their fear of the Khawarizmis, but once that fear was gone, now the Ayyubids and the Seljuks started to fight with each other. Right? Look at this. It's a very sad state of affairs. Muslims fighting with Muslims. When they have, the Christian enemy there as well. But instead the Muslims are too busy fighting with each other. So that's what was going on. The Ayyubids were fighting with the Seljuks. In the meantime, in Spain, a situation was brewing there as well. In Spain, the Christians in Andalus were expanding. And in the year 1236, right, this is in the same time frame, in the year 1236, the Christians conquered Qurtuba. The Christians conquered Qurtuba in the year 1236, and that was something that was very tragic for the Muslim Ummah as well. Right? So it was a time of a lot of chaos, a lot of instability, a lot of infighting amongst the Muslims. Right? It was a very, very delicate situation that the Muslims were dealing with throughout the Muslim world. So inshallah we'll stop there for today bi'idhnillah, and inshallah next week we will continue with the history of the Holy Land bi'idhnillah. Jazakumullah khair wa barakallahu feekum. Wallahu a'lam wa sallallahu wa sallam wa baraka ala nabiyyina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in.